Badi was also working in the poultry industry, but then he moved out of the poultry industry, so he has a genetic background. He moved to FAO in Rome, and he's working now since more than 20 years for FAO, I think. It's close to 30, working already 20 years for FAO. And he's currently the head of the Animal and Genetic Resource Unit at the FAO. So he's working a lot about genetic resources, and actually at the moment he is working a lot around pastoral systems in different parts of the world. He will bring us another perspective on the topic. We're looking very much forward to your talk, Badi. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Andrea, for the invitation. And in this talk, I will address the role of the livestock sector and animal science in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In my presentation, I will talk about the livestock sector drivers and outcomes. I will talk about the livestock and the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and give some examples about the synergies and trade-offs between the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will end up sharing with you some suggestions and thought on how animal science can help the livestock sector achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's start with the first part and give you the drivers of the livestock sector development. The first driver is the population growth, as indicated this morning. And the population is about 7.3 billion people today, and it's projected to reach 8.6 billion by 2030 and 9.8 billion by 2050. Of the 2.2 billion increase, half of this increase will be in Africa. The second driver, as you know, is the urbanization. Today, 54% of the world's population live in urban areas. And by 2030, the world's population will be 60% urban and 40% rural, meaning that the urban population will increase by 1 billion, and 85% of this increase will take place in Asia and Africa. According to OECD, the global economy will grow by 2.8% annually, but growth in developing countries will be much stronger than in the developed ones. There will be major changes in the country's share of the global GDP. For example, India's share of the global GDP will be nearly as much as the share of the European zone, of the Eurozone. So the combination of population, urbanization, and economic growth will continue to fuel the demand for food in general and animal source food in particular. But the population growth will be the main driver for the increase in the demand. The per capita demand will grow, but only for certain commodities, like, as you can see here on the table on this graph, fresh dairy for milk. And according to FAO projections, the global milk production in 2030 will increase by more than 30% in comparison with the 2015-2017 as a baseline. Similarly, the global meat production is projected to increase by about 20% in comparison to the 2015-2017. But as you can see on the figure, most of this increase will take place in developing countries. And poultry, especially poultry meat, will remain the primary driver for growth in the global meat production. And production will expand in countries that produce a surplus of grain feed, or feed grain, sorry. Here we have the other outcome is the intensification. And this figure shows the relationship between extensively raised chicken at the national level and this GDP per capita. So in a nutshell, the higher the GDP, the lower will be the contribution of the extensive system at the national level. So based on these drivers and outcomes, the question is, what would be the sustainability of the livestock system? This brings me to my second part of the talk, that is the livestock and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As you know, in January 2016, the United Nations launched the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that you see here seek to address the root causes of hunger, poverty, but also the universal need for development. The adoption of the Agenda 2030 shifted the focus from fostering sustainable production per se to enhancing the contribution of the sector to the Sustainable Development Goals. Here we have a change in the mindset. In my presentation, I will address the sustainability of the livestock sector through 4 interrelated aspects. These are food and nutrition security, livelihood and economic growth, health and animal welfare, and climate and natural resource use. I will present some of the challenges and opportunities for each of these priority concerns and propose some areas of action for both policy and animal science. I will start with the food and nutrition security, and this relates directly to SDG 2, zero hunger. And all FAO's work on livestock converge to this SDG. However, the situation today that there are many are undernourished and many are obese. As you can see on this figure, after a decrease, the hunger number have increased again in part of sub-Saharan Africa, in Eastern Asia, and Western Asia, mainly due to conflict, wars, due to flood, and due to drought, as indicated this morning. And as a result of this, 815 million people go hungry every day. There is the other, what we call the hidden hunger. This is the macronutrient deficiencies. And the macronutrient deficiency lead to anemia, stunting, reduced human function, and reduced cognitive development. Over 1/3 of the Asian and African women suffer from anemia, and about 25% of the children below 5 years are stunted. At the same time, we have 680 million people in the world that are obese or overweight. But animal source food is important for healthy diet. Animal source food contribute globally to a human diet with 33% of protein intake and 17% of calorie intake. But this is not equitably distributed across regions and societies. As you can see on this table, animal source food are dense in essential micronutrients. These are difficult to obtain in adequate amount from plant-based food alone, as we have seen yesterday in one of the sessions yesterday afternoon. So including even modest quantity of animal source food in the diet will add much needed nutritional value. So what can we do together, development and a scientific community? We have to address the triple burden of malnutrition. This is food insecurity, macronutrient deficiency, and obesity. And we need to promote a healthy diet for all, especially during the first 1,000 days of life. This starts at the woman's pregnancy and until the 7th birthday of child birthday. We need also to improve management of livestock production systems through better management of genetic resources with focus on local breeds, husbandry, and animal health. The second sustainability concern is livelihood and economic growth. This relates to 4 SDGs: no poverty, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, and reduced inequality. But the situation today is that 1 in 8 people in the world live in extreme poverty. Indeed, as you can see here, globally, there are 746 million people live with less than $1.9 per day per person. And nearly half of these people rely on livestock for their livelihood. For these people, livestock provide a diverse product and services beyond food and nutrition. Livestock provide hide, leather, skin. Livestock provide traction, transport, and energy. It provides manure that fertilize the soil and increase the productivity of livestock crop mixed systems, but also livestock provide saving mechanisms that can be used in time of crisis, and thereby it helps or building the resilience of these people. But livestock contribute to the economic growth in all countries. But this contribution, as you can see here, is much higher in developed countries than in developing ones. The contribution of livestock to agriculture GDP in Europe and North Africa, for example, North America, for example, varies between 25 and 40% of the agriculture GDP, whereas in the other regions it varies between 15 and 25%. But the sector has grown much faster in developing regions than in developed ones. Intensive production of livestock is booming, as you all know. But the small-scale producers are not benefiting from the growth of the sector. There is increasing dichotomy between large-scale producers and small-scale producers in terms of access to land, capital, technology, and market. At the same time, a large part of the poor small-scale producers are women, and yet they do not have access to productive resources as men do. And as you also know, that the livestock sector uses child labor with young boys and girls attending herds instead of going to school. So what can we do together to address livelihood and economic growth? We should better understand the relationship between livestock growth and poverty reduction, and how can we make the livestock growth benefiting to the poor. We should also promote sustainable intensifications in all regions and in all production systems, and support inclusive value chains. We should also support value addition. As indicated earlier, the lower contribution of livestock or primary product of livestock to the agricultural GDP in developing countries is mainly due to the low added value to this product. Now I move to the third sustainability concern, that is animal and public health. You all know that 70% of pathogens affecting a human have animal origin. And zoonoses are responsible for an estimated 2.7 million human deaths per year. With the intensification of animal production comes an increased use of antimicrobials to treat and prevent diseases, but in many cases to promote growth. So, and most of the administered antimicrobial medicines are released in the environment. So overuse and misuse of antimicrobials contribute to the development of antimicrobial resistance. And it's estimated that 700,000 people dying every year because of disease-resistant infections. Here, estimates of the use of antimicrobials in the livestock sector in the world. And the author of this study showed that estimated that 63,000 tons of antibiotics are used by the livestock sector globally in 2010. The animal welfare. I think I will not say much more than on animal welfare. It is nicely covered by the previous speakers. So, what are the areas of action? We think that we should promote the One Health approach, which seeks to manage holistically the disease threats, taking into account the complex relationship between animal health, human health, and the environment. And we should improve biosecurity measures and good animal nutrition to optimize the use of antimicrobials. And we should treat welfare of animals as a priority in all production systems, not only to meet consumers' demand, but as a means to improve the health and the performance of the animals. So now I come to my last sustainability priority, which is climate and natural resource use. This sustainability priority is related, as you can see, to two SDGs, SDG 13, climate action, and SDG 15, life on land. The total area of agricultural land used by livestock for livestock feed and for livestock feed production at global level is estimated at about 2.5 billion hectares. But the vast majority of these land are not of direct use for human nutrition. So it's used for human nutrition through ruminants that convert the grass into animal protein. But at the same time, livestock use 40% of the global arable land. And this represents 560 million hectares. We estimated recently that the livestock sector consumes 6 billion tons of dry matter. But as you can see on this figure, most of what the livestock consume is not edible for human. So actually, the livestock consume, the fraction of the livestock ration that is edible for human is 14%. And this is it's mainly grain, but it represents 1/3 of the global cereal production. The relationship between livestock and climate change goes both ways. Climate change affects the livestock through the availability and quality of forage, the incidence and prevalence of diseases, and the loss of biodiversity. At the same time, the livestock affect climate change through the emission of greenhouse gas emissions. And we estimated that the livestock sector produces 7.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And this represents 14.5% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look at these emissions, we see that these emissions are mainly due to there are direct emissions and indirect emissions. The direct emissions are mainly due to enteric fermentation and to manure. The indirect emissions are both upstream and downstream the chain, upstream through the production of forage and other inputs, and downstream through the transport, processing, and storage of animal products. If we look at the intensity of the emission intensities according to different species, I must say that these intensities are expressed, or the emissions are expressed by unit of product. And as you can see here, 2/3 of the emissions are due to ruminants, large and small. But so the monogastrics are quite efficient in terms of emissions. But at the same time, monogastrics are in direct competition with human for the resources. However, low carbon livestock production is possible. And there is considerable scope to reduce the emissions and create offsets through efficient use of the resources and through nutrient cycling. And my colleagues at FAO have showed that the adoption of existing best practices and technologies in animal feeding, health, and husbandry, and manure management we could and would allow to cut the greenhouse emissions by up to 30%. As you can see on this figure, these the emission reductions are not only for in developing countries, but there is also quite a good scope to reduce these emissions even in developed countries. So what can we do together? First, we need to improve the quantification of the greenhouse gas emissions. We need to improve the metrics and the methods of quantification. And we need to improve the animal productivity, as mentioned yesterday during the session. And this can be by acting at different levels on feed and nutrition, on animal health and husbandry, and through genetics. And yesterday it was proposed that why not selecting for lower emissions during the session. The soils can actually store much more carbon than they currently do. And it's possible to fix carbon in the soil through better management of the pasture, but also through integrating trees with pasture, what is referred to as silvopastoralism. And another area of action is the integration of the livestock in the circular bioeconomy. And we have discussed long yesterday about this, action. And this would allow to minimize the leaks of nutrients and energy from the system through the use of crop residues, byproducts, but also through better pricing of the externalities of the system and through probably reducing the incentive to some inputs like fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, or like fossil fuel. And another approach would be to promote agroecology and enhance the biodiversity and the provision of ecosystem services by livestock. And why not promote a payment for ecosystem services? So now I come to my third part of my talk is, as we have seen that the livestock contributed to several SDGs, but actually we just about publishing releasing a publication where we show that the livestock contribute directly and indirectly to all SDGs. Some of the contributions are positive, others are negative. So what we need to do is we need to optimize the synergies between the SDGs, and we need to manage the trade-offs between these synergies. Here, I'm going just to give you a few examples of these trade-offs. As we've seen earlier, the development of the livestock sector would increase the contribution of the sector to economic growth, but at the same time will constrain the availability of land for staple foods. And this will drive the prices up and may threaten food and nutrition security for the poor households. We can shift to monogastrics, and this may reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, it may increase the use of grain and legumes for animal feed. And this same result may result in threatening food and nutrition security. Intensification. Definitely intensification increase the efficiency and output. And this would increase food availability, reduce environmental burden, and may reduce emissions intensities. But at the same time, as we have seen, this may result in increase of the risk for animal health and welfare, and may result in increasing the risk of inequality between small and large-scale producers. So, in summary, excuse me. The UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is now the overarching framework that should guide the development of the livestock sector, taking into account the synergies and the trade-offs between these SDGs. We have seen, as indicated, we have seen that the livestock sector has an important role for food security and nutrition, poverty reduction and economic growth, but also for the resilience of vulnerable populations. And I hope I have demonstrated that the livestock sector has an important role for a healthy diet, for child growth and cognitive development. But at the same time, we should recognize and account for the diversity and multiple functions of the sector, including the ecosystem services provided by livestock. We believe that the animal science and research should provide the necessary objectivity and a passionate debate, but sometimes biased debate, on the livestock sector sustainability. And as we have seen in this conference and others, we are living a passionate area or fantastic time of technological developments, but our stake is how developing countries can benefit from these advances and these technologies. We fear that this technology may increase the gap between developed and developing countries. So how can we work together so that these countries can benefit from these advances? We believe that research and development are needed on three levels: on the biophysical processes to identify efficiency gains through improvement in feed, genetic resources, animal health, food and feed competition, and technological innovations for the protection of the environment. We also think that research and development are needed to work on the food production and food processes, work on territories trajectories. Where are we going with the rural areas? On modeling scenarios of development, integrating not only supply and demand, but also land use and land use changes. And the third area is traditionally not the focus of the science and research, but we believe that there is an important role to play there. That is governance, institutional and political processes to create the necessary incentives or regulations to build inclusive market models and provide the information, the tools to better invest in the livestock sector. And last but not least, we would like to see more engagement from the scientific community to enhance the international cooperation with low and mid-income countries. With this, thank you for your attention and happy to respond.
Thank you very much, Badi, for this excellent talk. One or two questions directly to Badi, and then we'll ask the other speakers to come up and we start with the discussion. Do you have one or two questions for Badi? Yes, please. Can we have a micro here? Perfect.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. What do you think? Are we doing enough to transform from a knowledge society into an acting society? Because what I experience is a lot of lethargy with all these topics that you have mentioned. Are we strong enough to compete with all these issues that you've mentioned?
Well, we have been discussing for hours yesterday about this issue, and everybody agrees that we need to do something. And there is a basket of options that we can do. Maybe I didn't mention in my presentation, but I indicated this yesterday, that if we look at the meat consumption, there is a wide variety in terms of meat consumption between regions. And the diets are different. But if we look at only at protein consumption, the consumption varies between 4 kilograms per person per year to more than 100 kilograms per person per year, depending on the regions. So where there is also there is overconsumption of animal source food, there is also possibility, or maybe we have to encourage a reduction of meat consumption even for health purposes. But the idea is that there is a basket of options, as I indicated in my talk, through management, through reduction of meat consumption, and through creating offsets, stocking carbon in the soil. So we have to tackle all this at the same time. There is no one solution is going to solve the problem.